In the humid summer of 1847, 13 members of the prominent Beauregard family died within hours of each other in their Garden District mansion in New Orleans. The official records, buried deep in the Louisiana State Archives, list the cause as sudden fever. But the hastily scribbled notes in the margins tell a different story. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, the attending physician, wrote in his private journal that he had never witnessed such synchronized agony, and that the symptoms bore no resemblance to any known disease. The victims' fingernails had turned black, their tongues swollen purple, and their final screams echoed through the mansion's halls until dawn. What makes this case even more disturbing is that every single death occurred exactly 90 minutes after the family's traditional Sunday supper, and the only person in the house who survived was Violet, the head cook in the kitchen. For over a century and 70 years, this tragedy has remained one of New Orleans' most carefully guarded secrets, hidden behind a wall of shame, fear, and deliberate silence. But tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about what really happened in that kitchen and why an entire bloodline disappeared in a single evening. Before we continue with the story of Violet and the Beauregard massacre, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because stories like this one are exactly why we dive deep into America's darkest forgotten histories. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from across the country. The truth about that fatal Sunday supper began years before the first drop of poison touched aristocratic lips, rooted in a cycle of cruelty that would eventually demand its due. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of stark contrasts, where magnificent mansions rose like monuments to wealth, while the foundation of that prosperity rested on human bondage. The Garden District, where Spanish moss draped over wrought iron balconies like funeral shrouds, housed the city's elite, sugar plantation owners, cotton merchants, and shipping magnates who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor. The Beauregard mansion stood as one of the district's crown jewels, a three-story Greek Revival masterpiece with towering Corinthian columns that seemed to scrape the Louisiana sky. Octave Beauregard had inherited both the house and the family's vast sugar plantation from his father, along with a reputation for being what polite society called a strict disciplinarian, and what his slaves knew as something far more sinister. At 43, Octave commanded his household with the same iron fist he used to rule his plantation. His wife, Celeste, a delicate woman from a prominent Creole family, had long ago learned to turn a blind eye to her husband's cruelties in exchange for maintaining her position in society. Their 4 children, Etienne, 19, Margot, 17, Philippe, 15, and little Amélie, just 8, had been raised to view the enslaved people around them as property, no different from the fine china or silver candlesticks that adorned their dining room. The mansion housed not just the immediate family, but also Octave's younger brother Auguste and his wife Lucille, with their twin sons, Henri and Louis, both 14. Auguste served as overseer of the plantation's business affairs in the city, while Lucille fancied herself a patron of the arts, hosting elaborate salons for New Orleans' cultural elite. Completing the household were Octave's elderly mother, Grandmère Beauregard, who at 78 still wielded considerable influence over family decisions, and Celeste's spinster sister, Tante Félicité, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes missed nothing that transpired within the mansion's walls. In this world of privilege and power lived 26 enslaved souls, each bearing the invisible scars of their bondage, but none bore heavier scars than Violet. Violet had been born in the mansion's slave quarters in 1823, the daughter of Essie, the previous head cook, who had died of exhaustion when Violet was barely 14. From that tender age, Violet had been thrust into the role of feeding the very family that owned her body and soul. She possessed an almost supernatural skill in the kitchen. Her hands seemed to know exactly how much spice to add, how long to let the roux darken, and which herbs would transform simple ingredients into culinary masterpieces that earned the Beauregards praise throughout New Orleans society. But Violet's talents came at a price that few in the house understood. She worked 18 hours a day, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and collapsing long after midnight once the last dish had been cleaned. Her small, windowless room in the servants' quarters contained nothing but a straw mattress, a single change of clothes, and a small wooden cross that had belonged to her mother. What made Violet's situation even more unbearable was her unique position in the household hierarchy. As head cook, she was expected to maintain the family's reputation for hosting the finest dinners in the district, yet she was forbidden from tasting the very food she prepared. She knew the texture of every sauce by sight, the doneness of every roast by smell, and the sweetness of every dessert by intuition alone. This cruel irony wasn't lost on Octave, who took perverse pleasure in reminding her that while she created food fit for kings, she would eat nothing but scraps for the rest of her life. The other enslaved people in the household looked to Violet with a mixture of respect and pity. They respected her skills and the small privileges her position afforded. She was rarely whipped, never sent to work in the cane fields, and sometimes received cast-off dresses from the ladies of the house. But they also pitied her isolation, for her demanding schedule left little time for the friendships and small moments of joy that made their harsh existence bearable. Among the household staff was Samuel, the stable master's son, who at 28 had caught Violet's eye despite the dangers such attraction could bring. Their stolen glances across the courtyard and whispered conversations in the kitchen after midnight had blossomed into something deeper, though both knew that love was a luxury slaves could rarely afford. Samuel dreamed of somehow purchasing their freedom and starting a life together in the free territories, but on a plantation where a strong field hand might earn his master $50 a year in profit. Such dreams seemed as distant as the stars. There was also old Moses, the butler who had served the family for over 40 years and whose bent back and graying hair told the story of decades spent bowing to Beauregard demands. Moses had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the family's needs, appearing with wine before it was requested and knowing exactly when to make himself invisible during their more private conversations. His loyalty to the family was legendary among New Orleans society, though those who looked closely might have noticed the cold fire that burned in his ancient eyes. Young Lily, barely 16, worked as a lady's maid to Celeste and her daughters. Her beauty had not gone unnoticed by the men of the house, and she lived in constant fear of the attention such notice might bring. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying to remain invisible while performing her duties with the perfection expected of her. In the stables worked Thomas, Samuel's father, whose knowledge of horses was matched only by his understanding of how to survive in a world designed to break him. Thomas had outlived 3 masters and buried 2 wives, learning long ago that the key to survival was never letting your true thoughts show on your face. The mansion's daily routine followed a precise schedule that had been established over decades. Breakfast was served at 7 sharp, with the family gathering in the morning room overlooking the garden. Luncheon occurred at 1 o'clock, often featuring guests from New Orleans society who came to discuss business or social matters. But it was the Sunday supper that represented the crown jewel of the week's dining. Every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, the entire extended family would gather in the grand dining room beneath the crystal chandelier that had been imported from Paris at tremendous expense. The table, which could seat 20, would be set with the finest china, sterling silver, and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars. These Sunday suppers were sacred to the Beauregards, a time when business was set aside and family bonds were celebrated and strengthened. For Violet, Sunday suppers represented the culmination of her weekly efforts. She would begin preparing on Friday, selecting the finest ingredients from the French market, planning a menu that would showcase her skills while honoring the family's Creole heritage. The meal typically consisted of 7 courses: a light soup, fish prepared with delicate sauces, fowl seasoned with exotic spices, multiple vegetable dishes featuring whatever was freshest from the garden, elaborate meat courses that demonstrated both her skill and the family's wealth, and finally, desserts that were works of art as much as food. The family's Sunday ritual was as predictable as the sunrise. They would gather in the parlor at 5:30 for cocktails, the men enjoying imported brandy while the ladies sipped delicate cordials. Conversation would flow over topics ranging from plantation business to New Orleans gossip, with the children expected to listen respectfully to their elders. At precisely 6 o'clock, old Moses would announce that supper was served, and the family would process into the dining room with the ceremony of a religious procession. Octave always sat at the head of the table, with Celeste at the opposite end. The children and extended family members took their assigned seats according to a hierarchy that had been established years ago and never varied. Grandmère Beauregard, despite her advanced age, maintained her position of honor at Octave's right hand, while Auguste sat to his left. The conversation during these meals was carefully orchestrated, with each family member understanding their role in maintaining the image of harmonious prosperity. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed domestic tranquility, tensions simmered like a pot ready to boil over. The spring of 1847 had brought unusual stress to the Beauregard household. The sugar crop had been poor the previous year due to flooding, and creditors were beginning to make uncomfortable inquiries about outstanding debts. Octave had been forced to sell several pieces of property and was considering the unthinkable option of selling some of his slaves to raise capital. These financial pressures had made Octave even more volatile than usual. His temper, which had never been pleasant, had become explosive and unpredictable. The enslaved people of the household learned to read the warning signs. The way his jaw would clench when reviewing ledgers, the sharp tone he would use when giving orders, and most dangerously, the way his eyes would grow cold and calculating when he was planning some new cruelty. It was during this period of mounting tension that Violet's relationship with Samuel began to deepen into something that could no longer be hidden or ignored. The catalyst for the tragedy that would unfold came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late June 1847, when the Louisiana heat seemed to press down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. Violet was in the kitchen preparing for a dinner party the Beauregards were hosting for visiting Charleston plantation owners, carefully arranging canapes, when she heard Samuel's voice from the courtyard, raised in what sounded like distress. She rushed to the kitchen window and saw a scene that would forever change the course of her life. Samuel was on his knees in the dusty courtyard, his shirt torn and bloody, while Octave stood over him with a leather whip in his hand. The master's face was twisted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed accusations. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes?" Octave's voice carried clearly through the humid air. "You forget your place, boy." Violet's blood turned to ice as she realized what had happened. Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been spending more time in the stables recently, and Violet had noticed the way the girl's cheeks would flush whenever Samuel was nearby. She had also seen Samuel's discomfort at this unwanted attention, his careful attempts to avoid being alone with any of the white women in the household. But in the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was interpreted as presumption, and presumption was a crime punishable by death. "Please, Master Beauregard," Samuel gasped between blows. I would never." "Silence." Octave's whip cracked again, leaving another bloody stripe across Samuel's back. "Your silence is guilt enough." But it was what happened next that sealed everyone's fate. As Octave raised his arm for another blow, Violet couldn't contain herself any longer. She burst from the kitchen door and threw herself between the whip and Samuel's bleeding back. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "Samuel done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard. The words died in her throat as Octave's face turned toward her, his expression shifting from rage to something far more dangerous, cold, calculating fury. The other slaves in the courtyard seemed to shrink back into the shadows, sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "So," Octave said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his previous shouting, "the cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." Violet's knees began to shake, but she didn't move from her position shielding Samuel. "No, Master, You just what?" Octave stepped closer, so close she could smell the brandy on his breath and see the network of broken blood vessels in his eyes. "You just think you can interfere with your betters? You think because you can cook a decent meal, you have the right to question my judgment?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Samuel's labored breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird from somewhere in the garden. Violet knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return, but as she looked down at Samuel's bleeding form, she realized she didn't care. "Samuel is a good man," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Octave's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "A good man? He's property, girl. My property. And so are you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've gotten ideas above your station." What followed was a punishment that went far beyond physical pain. Octave ordered Samuel to be locked in the stable's tack room with no food or water, declaring that he would remain there until he learned proper respect. But for Violet, he devised something far more cruel. "From now on," he announced to the assembled household, "Violet will prepare all meals as usual. But she will not eat until every member of this family has declared themselves satisfied with her work. And since I am very difficult to satisfy," he let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The next 3 days were a nightmare beyond description. Violet continued to prepare elaborate meals for the family while subsisting on nothing but water and the occasional scrap that old Moses or Lily could sneak to her when no one was watching. Her hands shook as she kneaded bread. Her vision blurred as she stirred sauces, and her legs could barely support her weight as she carried heavy platters to the dining room. But worse than her physical suffering was the psychological torture Octave inflicted. He would find fault with every dish. The soup was too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables overcooked, and each criticism meant another day without food. He took visible pleasure in describing the flavors and textures of each dish while she stood in the corner of the dining room, forced to watch him eat the food she had prepared but could not taste. On the second day of her punishment, Samuel managed to escape from the tack room, driven by desperation and concern for Violet. He made it as far as the kitchen before Octave's men caught him. The beating that followed was savage enough that Dr. Thibodeau had to be called to ensure Samuel wouldn't die before Octave was finished with him. It was while tending to Samuel's wounds that Dr. Thibodeau made an observation that would prove crucial to understanding what followed. As he cleaned Samuel's injuries, he noticed that Violet was hovering nearby, her face gaunt from hunger, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "That girl," he told his wife later that evening, "has the look of someone who has been pushed past the breaking point. I've seen it before in slaves who have been driven too far. It's a dangerous look, Doctor." Thibodeau was a man who understood the delicate balance that held plantation society together. Born into a family of modest means, he had worked his way up to become one of New Orleans' most respected physicians, serving both the wealthy plantation families and, when his conscience demanded it, providing secret medical care to slaves whose masters would rather let them die than pay for treatment. He had seen enough cruelty over the years to understand its effects on the human soul. He knew that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply break. They would become hollow shells, going through the motions of life without really living. But some, a dangerous few, would transform their suffering into something harder and more focused. These were the ones who would smile while planning revenge, who would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. As he looked at Violet that day, tending to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling with exhaustion, but were instead steady with purpose, Dr. Thibodeau recognized the signs. He made a mental note to warn Octave that his cruelty was creating a dangerous situation. But like many such good intentions, it was something he kept meaning to do until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet died, and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room watching Octave savor a piece of her famous praline bread pudding, describing its flavors with theatrical enthusiasm while she swayed on her feet from hunger, a cold clarity settled over her mind like fog rolling in from the Mississippi. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way Octave's hand shook slightly when he was nervous, indicating that his financial troubles were worse than the family let on. The way Celeste's eyes would dart to the brandy decanter when she thought no one was looking, suggesting that the lady of the house was developing a dependency on alcohol to cope with her life. The way young Philippe would steal glances at Lily when he thought his parents weren't watching. A look that made Violet's stomach turn with its implications. But most importantly, she began to pay attention to the family's routines, their preferences, their habits. She noticed that Grandmère Beauregard always took her medicine exactly 30 minutes before meals. She observed that Auguste had a nervous habit of checking his pocket watch precisely every 15 minutes during dinner. She saw that little Amélie always ate her vegetables first, saving her favorite parts of the meal for last. These observations, which had once been simply part of her job as a cook, now took on a different significance. She began to see the family not as her oppressors, but as a puzzle to be solved, a problem that required the right solution. It was on that third night, as she finally collapsed on her straw mattress after Octave had grudgingly declared himself marginally satisfied with her evening meal, that Violet made the decision that would seal all their fates. She would continue to serve the Beauregard family with the same skill and dedication she had always shown, but she would serve them in a way they would never forget. The plan that began to form in her mind was not born of sudden rage or desperate impulse. It was crafted with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to her finest meals, seasoned with the patient wisdom she had learned from years of observing the family's habits and preferences. She would wait for the perfect moment, and when that moment came, she would serve the Beauregard family a meal they would remember for eternity. As July blazed into existence with temperatures that seemed to melt the very air, Violet's outward behavior returned to what the family considered normal. She resumed her duties with quiet efficiency, her face a mask of proper servitude that gave no hint of the calculations taking place behind her dark eyes. To the casual observer, it appeared that Octave's punishment had achieved its intended effect. His rebellious cook had been broken and returned to her proper place in the household hierarchy. But those who knew Violet well began to notice subtle changes. Old Moses, whose decades of survival had taught him to read people like weather signs, observed that Violet's movements had acquired a different quality. Where once she had worked with the fluid grace of someone who loved her craft, now she moved with the mechanical precision of clockwork. Her famous intuition in the kitchen, the ability to taste a sauce with her eyes or know exactly when bread was ready by the sound of the oven, seemed to have sharpened into something almost supernatural. Samuel, still recovering from his beating in the slave quarters, watched Violet with growing concern during their stolen moments together. The woman he had fallen in love with had possessed a warmth that could melt butter and a laugh that could chase away the darkest sorrows. The woman who now visited him in the pre-dawn darkness seemed carved from different material entirely. Her touch was still gentle when she cleaned his wounds, but her eyes held a coldness that reminded him uncomfortably of the way snakes looked at their prey just before striking. "Violet," he whispered one morning as she prepared to return to the kitchen. "You're scaring me, girl. What's going on in that head of yours?" She paused at the door, her silhouette framed against the pale morning light filtering through the quarter's single window. When she turned back to look at him, Samuel saw something in her face that made his blood run cold. "I'm going to take care of everything," she said quietly. "You don't need to worry anymore." "What do you mean, take care of everything?" But she was already gone, leaving Samuel with the terrible certainty that the woman he loved was planning something that would destroy them all. The changes in Violet's behavior were subtle enough that the Beauregard family remained oblivious to them. If anything, they were pleased with what they saw as the positive effects of Octave's discipline. Violet's meals had always been exceptional, but now they seemed to reach new heights of culinary artistry. Her presentations became more elaborate, her flavor combinations more sophisticated, and her attention to detail almost obsessive in its perfection. What the family didn't realize was that Violet had begun conducting a different kind of research. During her daily trips to the French market, she made stops that had nothing to do with food preparation. She began visiting the herb vendors and medicine women who operated in the shadows of New Orleans' official commerce, asking questions about plants and their properties that might have seemed innocent to a casual observer but carried much darker implications. New Orleans in 1847 was a city where the boundaries between medicine and magic, between healing and harm, were often blurred. The influence of African traditions, Caribbean voodoo practices, and Native American plant knowledge had created an underground network of healers and practitioners who understood the dual nature of many natural substances. What could cure in small doses could kill in larger ones, and what could heal the body might also poison it, depending on the knowledge and intentions of the person doing the mixing. Violet's visits to these practitioners were careful and spaced far apart. She never asked direct questions, but instead engaged in seemingly casual conversations about herbs and their uses. She learned which plants could cause stomach pain that might be mistaken for food poisoning, which mushrooms could induce symptoms that resembled sudden fever, and most importantly, which combinations of natural substances could produce effects that would puzzle even experienced doctors. Her most valuable source of information came from an unlikely friendship she developed with Mama Brigitte, an elderly Creole woman who sold herbs and remedies at a stall in the deepest corner of the French market. Mama Brigitte was rumored to be over 90 years old, though her exact age was a mystery that seemed to deepen rather than resolve with time. She had been born free in Haiti before the Great Revolution, and her knowledge of plants and their properties was legendary among those who knew where to look for such wisdom. Mama Brigitte never asked why a kitchen slave was so interested in learning about the medicinal properties of various herbs and roots. Perhaps she sensed the desperation beneath Violet's careful questions, or perhaps she simply understood that knowledge was a form of power that should not be denied to those who needed it most. Whatever her reasons, she began to share information that no respectable apothecary would ever discuss with a slave. "This root here," she would say, holding up a gnarled piece of what looked like tree bark. "It good for stomach troubles in small amounts, but you use too much, and it cause problems the other way. Make a person very sick, very quick." Violet absorbed this information like a sponge, filing away every detail for future reference. She learned about plants that could cause respiratory distress, herbs that could affect heart rhythm, and mushrooms that could produce neurological symptoms that might easily be mistaken for apoplexy or sudden fever. But perhaps most valuable of all, she learned about timing and dosage. Mama Brigitte explained how the human body processed different substances, how long it took for various poisons to take effect, and how to calculate dosages based on body weight and constitution. This knowledge transformed Violet's understanding of her craft. She began to see cooking not just as a way to nourish bodies, but as a means to control them. As summer progressed, Violet began conducting small experiments that went completely unnoticed by the household. She would add tiny amounts of various herbs to different dishes, carefully observing the family's reactions. A pinch of one root might cause Auguste to complain of mild indigestion. A small amount of another herb might make young Philippe feel slightly nauseous after dinner. These experiments taught her about individual tolerances, sensitivities, and reactions that would prove crucial to her ultimate plan. The family, of course, attributed any minor digestive issues to the heat and humidity of the Louisiana summer. When Celeste complained of occasional stomach upset, Dr. Thibodeau prescribed a mild tonic and advised her to avoid rich foods during the hottest part of the day. When little Amélie seemed listless after a few meals, it was chalked up to the natural effects of the oppressive heat on a child's constitution. Meanwhile, Violet's relationship with the other slaves began to change in ways that reflected her growing isolation and single-minded focus. She had always been somewhat apart from the rest of the household staff due to her demanding position and long hours. But now she began to withdraw even from those few friendships that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her servitude. Lily, who had often sought Violet's advice and comfort during her most difficult moments, found her approaches met with polite but distant responses. Old Moses, who had served as something of a father figure to Violet since her mother's death, noticed that their conversations became increasingly superficial and brief. Even Thomas, Samuel's father, began to feel uncomfortable around Violet, sensing something in her demeanor that reminded him of dangerous dogs he had known. Quiet and controlled on the surface, but coiled and ready to strike. The only person who seemed to have any insight into Violet's true state of mind was Samuel, and even he was kept at arm's length as she focused more and more intensively on her preparations. During their rare moments together, he would try to draw her out, to understand what was happening behind her increasingly impenetrable facade. "You're changing, Violet," he told her one night in August as they sat in the small garden behind the slave quarters, speaking in whispers to avoid detection. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize." Violet looked up at the stars, barely visible through the oppressive humidity inside. For a moment, her mask slipped, and Samuel saw a glimpse of the pain and rage she had been carrying alone for so many weeks. "They took everything from me," she said quietly. "My mama, my childhood, my freedom. And when I finally found something worth caring about, when I found you, they took that too. They beat you like an animal and made me watch. They starved me and made it into entertainment." Samuel reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "That don't mean you got to become like them." "I'm not becoming like them," Violet replied, and the coldness in her voice made Samuel's skin crawl. "They destroy because they enjoy it. I'm going to destroy because it's necessary." "What are you planning, Violet? What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before, a kind of peace that was somehow more terrifying than any rage could have been. "I'm going to serve them exactly what they deserve," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." As summer began its slow transition into fall, Violet's preparations entered their final phase. She had identified the substances she would need, tested their effects in small doses, and studied the family's routines until she could predict their behavior with clock-like precision. Now all that remained was to choose the perfect moment and execute her plan with the same flawless precision she brought to preparing a 7-course meal. The opportunity she had been waiting for presented itself in late September when Octave announced that the family would be hosting a grand Sunday supper to celebrate the successful harvest of their sugar crop. The meal would mark not just the end of the growing season, but also Octave's triumph over the financial difficulties that had plagued him throughout the year. Creditors had been paid, debts satisfied, and the plantation was once again on solid financial footing. It would be, Octave declared, a feast to remember. As September's heat began to ease into the more bearable warmth of early fall, the Beauregard mansion buzzed with preparations for what Octave had declared would be the finest Sunday supper New Orleans has ever witnessed. The successful sugar harvest had not only rescued the family from their financial difficulties, but had also restored Octave's confidence in his position as one of the city's most prominent plantation owners. The guest list for this celebration read like a who's who of Louisiana society. Judge Honoré Dufresne and his wife would attend, along with banker Edouard Blanchard and the influential merchant Alcée Boudreau. The Reverend Father Antoine Marigny would bless the meal, while Dr. Armand Thibodeau would be present both as family physician and as one of Octave's oldest friends. Even Mayor Augustus Chouteau had accepted the invitation, bringing the total number of guests to 23 souls who would join the 13 members of the Beauregard family for an evening of celebration and excess. For Violet, this represented the culmination of everything she had been working toward. A grand Sunday supper with the extended family and New Orleans' most prominent citizens would provide the perfect stage for her final performance. The scale of the event would require her to work with absolute precision, coordinating multiple courses while maintaining the flawless timing that had made her reputation throughout the city. But what made this evening particularly perfect for Violet's purposes was a decision Octave had made regarding the staff. Due to the importance of the occasion, he had decreed that all the house slaves would remain in the mansion throughout the evening, ready to attend to any need that might arise. This meant that when the moment came, everyone who had participated in or witnessed her humiliation would be present to see its resolution. As the days leading up to the supper unfolded, Violet threw herself into preparations with an intensity that impressed even the jaded members of the Beauregard household. She spent hours at the French market, selecting ingredients with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. Each tomato was examined for perfect ripeness, each cut of meat inspected for ideal marbling, and each herb tested for optimal potency and freshness. Her menu for the evening was a masterpiece of Creole cuisine that would showcase not only her skills, but also the full range of her knowledge about food and its effects on the human body. The meal would begin with a delicate turtle soup, seasoned with precisely the right balance of herbs to stimulate appetite and create a sense of anticipation for what would follow. This would be followed by pompano prepared with an elaborate sauce that required hours of careful preparation and timing. The third course would feature squab stuffed with an intricate mixture of rice, vegetables, and seasonings that had been in Violet's family for generations, though she had made certain modifications to the traditional recipe that none of her ancestors would have approved of. The meat courses would include both beef and pork, prepared in different styles, accompanied by vegetables from the mansion's own garden and bread that had been rising for exactly the right amount of time to achieve perfect texture and flavor. But it was the dessert course that represented Violet's true masterpiece. She planned to serve her famous bread pudding, made with pralines and a custard sauce that had been the talk of New Orleans society for years. The recipe had been her mother's secret, passed down through generations of enslaved cooks who had perfected it in plantation kitchens throughout Louisiana. Violet had spent years refining the dish until it reached a level of complexity and sophistication that made it the requested finale for every important Beauregard dinner. What none of the diners would realize was that Violet had spent the past month perfecting a very different kind of recipe, one that would transform this celebration into something far more memorable than any of them could possibly imagine. Her final preparations began on Friday morning when she made her last visit to Mama Brigitte's stall in the French market. The old woman greeted her with the same knowing smile she had worn during all their previous encounters, but this time there was something different in her ancient eyes, a kind of sadness that seemed to acknowledge what was about to unfold. "You sure about this path you're walking, child?" Mama Brigitte asked as she wrapped the final herbs Violet would need in a piece of brown paper. "Once you start down this road, there ain't no turning back." Violet met her gaze without flinching. "I'm already too far down the road to turn back." They made sure of that. Mama Brigitte nodded slowly and handed over the package. "Then may God have mercy on all your souls," she whispered, "because none of you going to find it anywhere else." That weekend, as Violet began the intricate process of preparing for Sunday's feast, her behavior took on an almost ritualistic quality that disturbed those who observed it closely. She moved through the kitchen with the precision of a clockmaker assembling the most delicate timepiece, each action calculated and deliberate. Her usual practice of humming while she worked had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that seemed to fill the kitchen like fog. Samuel, still recovering from his injuries but now able to move around the plantation with limited mobility, found excuses to visit the kitchen throughout the weekend. What he saw there filled him with a dread he couldn't quite articulate. Violet worked with mechanical precision, her face expressionless as she prepared components of the meal with a kind of cold artistry that bore no resemblance to the joy she had once taken in cooking. On Saturday evening, as Violet finished the preliminary preparations for the next day's feast, Samuel finally confronted her directly. He waited until the kitchen was empty except for the two of them, then approached her as she stood cleaning her knives with obsessive thoroughness. "Violet, I'm begging you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you're planning, don't do it. We can find another way." She didn't look up from her work, but her hands stilled on the blade she was polishing. Another way to what, Samuel? To get free. To get justice. Justice. She finally raised her eyes to meet his, and Samuel saw something in them that made him step backward involuntarily. You think there's justice for people like us? You think if we just wait long enough, pray hard enough, work hard enough, someone's going to come along and set things right? I think if you do what you're planning, you're going to destroy yourself along with them. Violet set down her knife and turned to face him fully. I've already been destroyed, Samuel. What's left is just deciding whether I'm going to die alone or take them with me. And what about me? What about us? What? For the first time in weeks, Samuel saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with cross Violet's face. But it was gone so quickly, he might have imagined it. If you really love me, she said quietly, you'll find a way to not be here tomorrow night. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. Dear God, Violet, what have you done? But she had already turned back to her work, and Samuel knew that any chance he might have had to change her mind had passed weeks ago in a dusty courtyard under a blazing sun, when a whip had fallen across his back and something inside the woman he loved had died forever. Sunday, October 3rd, 1847, dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of autumn in the air that made New Orleans residents grateful for the end of another brutal summer. The Beauregard mansion came alive before sunrise, as the household staff prepared for what everyone understood would be the social event of the season. Violet rose before dawn, as she had every day for the past 10 years, but this morning held a significance that went far beyond routine. As she dressed in the clean white apron and head wrap that were the uniform of her position, she caught sight of herself in the small piece of broken mirror that served as her only vanity. The face that looked back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, hollow-cheeked from the weight she had lost during her punishment, with eyes that held a kind of terrible calm. She spent a moment studying her reflection, memorizing the face of the woman she had been, before turning away to begin the most important day's work of her life. The kitchen became a symphony of controlled chaos as Violet orchestrated the preparation of the most elaborate meal she had ever attempted. But unlike previous grand dinners, where she had worked alongside other kitchen staff, today she insisted on handling the most crucial elements entirely alone. She prepared the sauces in solitude, mixed the seasonings without assistance, and guarded her workspace with a jealousy that surprised even herself. Old Moses, whose duties as butler required him to coordinate between the kitchen and dining room, noticed that Violet seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of everyone's location in the house. She would pause in her work whenever footsteps approached, and several times he caught her listening intently to conversations in other rooms, as if she were tracking the movements of every person in the mansion. Girl's got ears like a cat today, he muttered to Lily as they polished silver in the pantry, acting stranger than I've ever seen her act. Lily, whose own nerves were stretched thin by the pressure of serving such important guests, nodded absently. She'd been acting strange for weeks now, ever since Master Octave punished her and Samuel. What neither of them realized was that Violet's heightened awareness served a very specific purpose. She had spent months learning the family's routines and habits, but today she needed to track their precise locations and activities to ensure that her timing would be perfect. Every element of her plan depended on synchronization that would make a Swiss clockmaker proud. As the morning progressed, the mansion filled with the sounds and smells of preparation. Fresh flowers were arranged in every room. Crystal was polished to a shine that seemed to capture and multiply candlelight, and the dining room table was set with a precision that bordered on the mathematical. The Beauregard family's finest china, imported from Limoges at tremendous expense, gleamed against Irish linen tablecloths, while sterling silver utensils caught the light from the chandelier like scattered stars. Around noon, the family members began their own preparations for the evening's festivities. Celeste spent hours with Lily, arranging her hair in an elaborate style that required dozens of pins and a liberal application of pomade. Grand-mère Beauregard, despite her advanced age, insisted on wearing her finest black silk dress and the emerald jewelry that had been in the family for 3 generations. The men of the family gathered in Octave's study to sample the imported brandy that would be served after dinner, their conversation ranging from the success of the sugar harvest to speculation about the political situation in Washington. Auguste, flushed with pride over the plantation's financial recovery, was in particularly good spirits, regaling the others with stories of his shrewd business negotiations. Young Philippe and the twin sons Henri and Louis had been given new suits for the occasion, while little Amélie was dressed in a white organdy dress that made her look like a small angel. The children had been strictly instructed on their behavior for the evening. They were to be seen and admired, but were to speak only when spoken to, and were never to interrupt adult conversation. As the afternoon wore on, guests began arriving at the mansion. Judge Dufresne and his wife Mathilde came first, followed shortly by banker Blanchard and his daughter Celestine, a young woman whose beauty and dowry had made her the target of every unmarried gentleman in New Orleans. Dr. Thibodeau arrived with his usual medical bag, though he hoped fervently that his services wouldn't be needed during what promised to be a joyous occasion. The arrival of Mayor Chouteau created a particular stir of excitement, as his presence lent an air of political importance to the gathering. The mayor, a portly man with impressive whiskers and a tendency toward florid speeches, immediately launched into congratulations for Octave's successful harvest and predictions about the bright future of Louisiana's sugar industry. But it was during the arrival of the guests that Violet executed one of the most crucial elements of her plan. As the house filled with visitors and the normal staff routines were disrupted by the demands of hospitality, she made her final additions to the evening's menu. Working with the concentrated focus of a pharmacist preparing medicine, she added carefully measured amounts of various substances to different components of the meal. Each dish received individual attention, with ingredients added based on her detailed knowledge of each diner's preferences, physical constitution, and position at the table. The amounts were calculated with mathematical precision, enough to achieve the desired effect, but distributed in such a way that no single dish would contain enough to arouse suspicion if analyzed individually. What made Violet's preparation particularly diabolical was her understanding of timing and cumulative effects. The substances she had chosen would work slowly and in combination, creating symptoms that would build gradually throughout the meal before reaching their crescendo all at once. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late to identify the source or provide effective treatment. As 6 o'clock approached, the family and their guests gathered in the parlor for cocktails and conversation. The atmosphere was one of celebration and triumph, with Octave holding court like a king receiving tribute from his subjects. The conversation flowed as freely as the imported wine, covering topics from the latest fashions in Paris to speculation about California gold discoveries. Violet, observing from her position in the kitchen doorway, felt a kind of cold satisfaction as she watched the assembled gathering. Every person who had contributed to her suffering, every member of the family who had participated in or ignored her humiliation, every pillar of the society that had created and maintained the system that had stolen her life. They were all here, dressed in their finest clothes and ready to partake of her masterwork. At exactly 6 o'clock, old Moses appeared in the parlor doorway and bowed respectfully. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in his most formal voice, "supper is served." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Beauregard mansion intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The procession to the dining room followed the established protocol that had governed Beauregard family meals for decades. Octave led the way with Mayor Chouteau, while Celeste followed with Judge Dufresne. The other guests and family members arranged themselves according to social hierarchy, with Grand-mère Beauregard taking her position of honor despite requiring assistance from young Etienne to navigate the short distance from parlor to dining room. The dining room had been transformed into a vision of opulence that would have impressed even the most jaded members of New Orleans society. Dozens of candles cast a warm glow over the assembled company, while crystal glasses caught and reflected the light like captured diamonds. The aroma of Violet's cooking filled the air with promises of culinary delights that had already set mouths watering throughout the house. As the diners took their assigned seats, a sense of anticipation filled the room. Octave had been praising Violet's skills throughout the week, building expectations for what he claimed would be the finest meal any of them had ever tasted. Even Dr. Thibodeau, who had eaten at the finest establishments in both New Orleans and Paris, found himself looking forward to experiencing the legendary artistry of the Beauregard kitchen. Violet herself remained invisible to the diners, working behind the scenes with old Moses and the other servants to ensure that each course was presented with flawless timing and presentation. But unlike previous grand dinners where she had taken visible pride in each dish as it left the kitchen, tonight she watched the service with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The first course, the delicate turtle soup, was received with the kind of enthusiastic praise that would have once filled Violet with joy. Judge Dufresne declared it a masterpiece of the culinary arts, while Banker Blanchard pronounced it superior to anything served in the finest restaurants of Paris. Even Grand-Mère Beauregard, whose critical nature was legendary, nodded her approval as she savored the complex blend of flavors. What none of the diners realized was that the soup contained the first of several carefully measured doses that would work in combination throughout the evening. The herbs Violet had selected would be absorbed slowly into their systems, building toward a cumulative effect that would manifest only when all the components were in place. The second course, Pompano prepared with an elaborate sauce that had required hours of preparation, continued to earn universal acclaim. Mayor Chouteau, whose appreciation for fine food was well known throughout the city, declared it worthy of the gods themselves and requested the recipe, which Octave proudly promised to obtain from his talented cook. As the meal progressed, the conversation in the dining room became increasingly animated and jovial. The wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and creating an atmosphere of celebration that seemed to grow more festive with each course. Stories were shared, jokes were told, and toasts were raised to everything from the successful harvest to the bright future of Louisiana as a state. But Violet, watching from the kitchen doorway, began to notice subtle changes in some of the diners that escaped the attention of everyone else. Auguste's usual hearty appetite seemed slightly diminished, though he continued to praise each dish enthusiastically. Celeste appeared to be experiencing mild discomfort, occasionally pressing her hand to her stomach in a gesture she tried to make subtle. Young Philippe looked slightly flushed, though this could easily be attributed to the excitement of dining with such distinguished guests. The meat courses were presented with a pageantry that drew gasps of admiration from the assembled company. The beef had been prepared according to a recipe that showcased not only Violet's technical skills, but also her artistic sensibilities, while the pork dish demonstrated flavor combinations that several of the guests declared they had never experienced before. It was during this portion of the meal that Dr. Thibodeau first noticed something that would later prove significant in his understanding of what transpired that evening. As he observed the other diners with the trained eye of a physician, he began to detect subtle signs of physical distress that seemed inconsistent with the joyful atmosphere. Grand-Mère Beauregard, despite her vocal appreciation of the food, appeared to be experiencing some difficulty swallowing. Her grandson Henri was perspiring more heavily than the warm evening would warrant. Banker Blanchard's usual animated conversation style seemed to require more effort than normal, as if he were fighting some kind of fatigue. But these observations were fleeting and easily dismissed in the context of a rich meal served on a warm evening to people who had been celebrating for hours. Dr. Thibodeau made mental notes, but saw no cause for immediate concern, particularly given the universal enthusiasm for each course as it was presented. The dessert course represented Violet's true masterpiece, not just of culinary art, but of her more sinister craft as well. The bread pudding was prepared exactly as her mother had taught her, with pralines that had been cooked to perfect caramelization and a custard sauce that achieved a consistency that seemed almost impossible to achieve. But hidden within this triumph of traditional Creole cooking was the final component of Violet's deadly recipe. As the dessert was served, accompanied by coffee and after-dinner cordials, the praise reached almost ridiculous heights. Mayor Chouteau declared that he would have to revise his opinion of what constituted the finest dessert in Louisiana, while Judge Dufresne suggested that Violet's talents were wasted in a private household and that she should be cooking for royalty. Octave basked in the reflected glory of his cook's abilities, accepting congratulations as if he himself had created the magnificent meal. He raised his glass in a toast to the finest cook in all of Louisiana, whose talents have made this evening a triumph that will be remembered for years to come. If he had only known how prophetic those words would prove to be. As the meal concluded and the diners settled back in their chairs, with the satisfied exhaustion that comes from consuming a truly memorable feast, the first unmistakable signs of distress began to manifest. Auguste, who had been regaling the table with amusing stories just moments before, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and pressed his hand to his throat, his face contorting in an expression of confusion and pain. "I feel," he began, but the words seemed to catch in his throat like thorns. Celeste, who had been fanning herself delicately with her silk fan, suddenly dropped it as her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion the color of old parchment. "Something's wrong," Dr. Thibodeau said, rising from his chair with the sudden alertness of a man whose medical training had just been activated by an emergency. But even as he spoke, he felt his own stomach lurching in a way that had nothing to do with overeating. Within minutes, the elegant dining room had transformed into a scene of chaos and horror. One by one, the diners began experiencing symptoms that progressed with terrifying rapidity. What had begun as mild discomfort escalated quickly into severe abdominal pain, accompanied by nausea, difficulty breathing, and a burning sensation that seemed to spread through their bodies like wildfire. Grand-Mère Beauregard was the first to collapse, her aged body unable to withstand the assault of the substances coursing through her system. She fell from her chair with a crash that shattered the crystal water glass in front of her, sending shards across the mahogany table like deadly snowflakes. Young Amélie, her white organdy dress now stained with perspiration and worse, began crying for her mother with a voice that grew progressively weaker as the poison did its work. Her small body, with its faster metabolism, processed the deadly substances more quickly than the adults, making her suffering both more intense and mercifully briefer. Mayor Chouteau, his political dignity forgotten in the face of mortal agony, crawled across the dining room floor toward the door, leaving a trail of vomit behind him as his body attempted futilely to purge itself of the substances that were systematically shutting down his organs. Dr. Thibodeau, even as his own vision began to blur and his hands shook uncontrollably, attempted to provide medical assistance to the other victims, but his training had never prepared him for anything like this. A mass poisoning that affected multiple body systems simultaneously and seemed designed to overwhelm every natural defense the human body possessed. "Get help," he managed to gasp to old Moses, who stood in the doorway frozen with shock at the scene unfolding before him. Send for... But the words died in his throat as another wave of agony doubled him over, and he realized with the clear-headed certainty that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis that help would arrive too late for any of them. In the kitchen, Violet stood perfectly still, listening to the sounds of chaos and death emanating from the dining room. Her face remained expressionless, but tears ran down her cheeks in steady streams, not tears of regret, but tears of release, as if a pressure that had been building inside her for months was finally finding its outlet. Samuel found her there, standing like a statue in the middle of the kitchen she had ruled for so many years. He had tried to follow her advice to absent himself from the plantation that evening, but his love for her had made it impossible to leave. Now, Hearing the screams and seeing her tears, he understood the full magnitude of what she had done. "Violet," he whispered, reaching toward her with hands that shook not from poison, but from grief. "What have you done?" She turned toward him, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something in her eyes that resembled the woman he had fallen in love with. But it was a resemblance only. The woman he had known was gone forever, replaced by someone who had been transformed by suffering into an instrument of justice as terrible and final as the grave itself. "I served them exactly what they deserved," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the diminishing sounds from the dining room. Nothing more, nothing less. By midnight, the Beauregard mansion had fallen silent, except for the whispered prayers of the surviving slaves and the scratch of Dr. Thibodeau's pen as he struggled to complete the death certificates required by law. His own survival remained a mystery that would puzzle him for the rest of his life. Perhaps his smaller portion sizes, due to his naturally modest appetite, had saved him, or perhaps his body's years of exposure to various medicines had given him some resistance to the deadly cocktail Violet had prepared. The official cause of death, recorded in the parish records that still exist today in the Louisiana State Archives, was listed as sudden fever of unknown origin. Dr. Thibodeau knew this was not accurate, but he also understood that the truth would serve no one. A mass poisoning at one of New Orleans' most prominent social gatherings would create panic throughout the city and destroy the reputation of everyone connected to the Beauregard name. More practically, he recognized that Violet had crafted her revenge with such skill that proving murder would be virtually impossible. The substances she had used were all naturally occurring, and their effects in combination would be impossible to identify with the medical knowledge and investigative techniques available in 1847. Any autopsy would reveal only that the victims had died of systemic organ failure, which could be attributed to any number of natural causes. The aftermath of what became known in whispered conversations as the Beauregard tragedy reverberated throughout New Orleans society for years to come. The plantation, with its entire owning family dead, was seized by creditors and sold at auction. The mansion itself stood empty for nearly a decade before being purchased by a northern businessman who had no knowledge of its history. The enslaved people of the Beauregard household were scattered to different buyers throughout Louisiana, their families broken apart in the cold mathematics of estate liquidation. Some, like old Moses and Thomas, were purchased by plantation owners who valued their experience and skills. Others, particularly the younger ones like Lily, disappeared into the vast network of human trafficking that supplied labor to sugar plantations throughout the South. Samuel survived long enough to be sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where he died 2 years later in an accident that may or may not have been truly accidental. Those who knew him said that he never recovered from the trauma of that October evening, and that he seemed to welcome death when it finally came for him. Violet herself vanished completely from the historical record after that night. Some accounts suggest that she was sold to a plantation in the remote parishes of Louisiana, where she died in obscurity within a few years. Others claim that she escaped during the chaos following the discovery of the bodies and made her way to freedom in the northern states or Canada. But the most persistent legend, whispered among the Creole communities of New Orleans for generations, held that Violet was never caught or sold because she had simply walked away from the plantation that night and disappeared into the shadows of the French Quarter. According to this version of events, she survived by using her extraordinary cooking skills to feed the poorest members of New Orleans society, living under an assumed name and finding a kind of redemption through service to those who needed help most. Dr. Thibodeau, who carried the secret of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life, left behind a private journal that was discovered by his descendants more than a century later. In it, he recorded his observations about that terrible evening and his growing understanding of how the crime had been committed. His notes reveal a deep admiration for the precision and skill with which Violet had planned and executed her revenge, even as he struggled with the moral implications of what she had done. She was not a killer by nature, He wrote in one entry dated several months after the tragedy. She was a woman driven to become something she had never wanted to be by circumstances that would have broken most people long before they reached her breaking point. If there is guilt to be assigned in this matter, it must be shared by all of us who participated in or tolerated the system that created such desperation. The Beauregard mansion, when it was finally occupied again in the late 1850s, became the site of numerous unexplained incidents that locals attributed to supernatural causes. Dinner guests reported feeling suddenly ill during meals, servants complained of strange smells emanating from the kitchen, and more than one cook quit after claiming to have seen the figure of a young black woman standing by the stove in the pre-dawn hours. These stories, combined with the persistent rumors about the real cause of the Beauregard family's demise, contributed to the mansion's reputation as one of New Orleans' most haunted houses. The building changed hands frequently over the following decades, with few owners remaining for more than a year or two before selling and moving elsewhere. During the Civil War, the mansion was briefly occupied by Union forces and later served as a temporary hospital for wounded soldiers. Military records from this period include several reports of patients experiencing mysterious illnesses that seem to have no medical explanation, leading to speculation that whatever had caused the original tragedy continued to affect those who entered the house. In the 1880s, the mansion was purchased by a historical society that intended to preserve it as an example of antebellum architecture. However, their efforts were frustrated by a series of accidents and setbacks that ultimately forced them to abandon the project. The building was finally demolished in 1894, with local newspapers reporting that the demolition crew found the kitchen to be in remarkably good condition despite decades of neglect, as if it had been preserved by some unknown force. The lot where the mansion once stood remained empty for many years, before being developed into a small park that exists to this day. Local residents still report unusual incidents in the area, sudden illnesses during community gatherings, the smell of cooking food when no kitchens are nearby, and occasional sightings of a young black woman in antebellum dress walking through the park in the early morning hours. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Violet's story lies not in ghost tales or supernatural speculation, but in the way it illustrates the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. The system of slavery that created the conditions for this tragedy was built on the assumption that human beings could be reduced to property, that their suffering could be ignored, and that their humanity could be denied indefinitely without consequence. Violet's story serves as a stark reminder that such assumptions were not only morally wrong, but also dangerously naive. Every system of oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and those seeds are often planted by the very cruelties that the system depends upon to maintain itself. The 13 members of the Beauregard family who died that October evening were not evil people in any simple sense of the word. They were products of their time and place, raised to see slavery as natural and normal, taught to view enslaved people as fundamentally different from themselves. But their willingness to participate in and benefit from a system built on human suffering created the conditions that would ultimately destroy them. In the end, Violet's vengeance was both completely understandable and utterly tragic. Understandable because of the inhuman treatment that drove her to it, and tragic because it represented the corruption of a soul that had once found joy in creating nourishment and bringing pleasure to others. The woman who had once taken pride in feeding people became someone who found purpose in destroying them, not because she was inherently evil, but because the world she lived in had left her no other path to dignity and justice. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying horrors are often those that grow out of human choices and social systems rather than supernatural forces. The real ghost that haunted the Beauregard mansion was not the spirit of any individual person, but the collective guilt of a society that had built its prosperity on the foundation of human bondage. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could such a carefully planned revenge really have been carried out with the precision Violet displayed? Or are there elements that seem too perfect to be entirely believable? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about whether justice was served or whether Violet's actions went too far. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkest chapters of American history often contain the most compelling human dramas, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.